In the year 1849, deep in the humid heart of Louisiana, there stood a plantation no map dares mark today, Belmore Estate. Locals whispered it was cursed, though no one could say by what hand. Its last owner, Colonel Asa Belmore, was known not only for his tobacco fields, but for the peculiar silence that haunted his house after dusk. When the census men arrived that spring, they recorded something strange. The colonel's daughter, Eleanor, age 17, had not been seen outside in over a year. Her name was written, then scratched out, then written again in another hand, as if someone had tried to erase her from record. Neighbors said she had grown ill, that she was moved to the slave quarters, where her screams would not echo through the main house. Others said she was changing, that her skin, once pale and freckled, had taken on a hue not her own. The Belmore family denied everything. But when the estate was abandoned a decade later, a single portrait of Eleanor was found in the attic, the paint warped and blistered, her eyes covered over with black tar. And beneath it was a handprint, not painted, pressed, still damp, as though whoever left it had never truly left at all. By the summer of 1850, the Belmore plantation had begun to rot from the inside out. The slaves whispered of a girl's voice carried through the trees at night, not crying, not speaking, but humming. A low, broken lullaby that never reached its end. Colonel Asa Belmore forbade anyone from entering the southern quarters, the oldest set of cabins near the swamp. He claimed they were unsafe, riddled with snakes and black mold. Yet the servants saw him go there each night, carrying trays of food that came back untouched. Those who disobeyed were punished. One boy, Caleb, 14 years old, was found wandering the fields one morning, trembling and blind. He kept saying her name. "Miss Eleanor," he whispered. "She ain't sick no more, she's awake." Within days, Caleb vanished. His mother said he followed the same voice back into the cypress grove and never returned. Records from the county physician, discovered decades later, show multiple deliveries of chloroform and surgical tools billed to Asa Belmore's account, items he had no earthly reason to need. Some say the colonel was trying to cure his daughter's affliction. Others believe he was trying to contain it. Whatever was happening in those quarters, it was never spoken of again. But late one autumn evening, when a storm tore open the roof of the slave cabins, something was found inside that would never be explained. A set of small, human teeth, wrapped in silk and buried in the ash beneath Eleanor's old bed. By 1851, the air around Belmore Estate had changed. The swamp mist crept higher into the fields, clinging to the fences like it wanted in. The overseers noticed it first, animals going still at twilight, cattle refusing to feed, the dogs howling toward the quarters as if warning something to stay back. The local doctor, Milton Cray, made 2 visits that year. In his journals, now kept in the parish archives, he wrote, "I was denied entry to the southern wing. The colonel insists his daughter is recovering. Yet I hear movement in the walls. Something breathing, deliberate, as though it listens for the silence between words." Within months, the disease spread through the field hands. Fever, lesions, bleeding gums, and skin that darkened along the veins like creeping ink. The afflicted said it began after touching a bowl of water outside Eleanor's door. By midwinter, entire families had fled the plantation, leaving behind cabins still burning their lamps. The colonel sealed the gates. No one entered or left. And then came the sound, a low, rhythmic dragging, heard from the main road each night. Those brave enough to look said they saw a figure in white moving between the cypress roots, stooped and trembling, its feet bare, its hair long and wet with black fluid. She called out only once, witnesses said, not for help, but for hunger. When the terror at Belmore reached the nearby town of Claremont Parish, whispers turned to sermons. Reverend Josiah Harker, a strict Presbyterian known for his booming voice and hollow eyes, declared the plantation a seat of blasphemy. He claimed God had turned his face away from the Belmores for mingling the living with the dead. One Sunday, after a child was found near the riverbank with black stains across her palms, Harker led a small procession to the estate gates. They carried torches, salt, and a Bible so worn its pages were nearly translucent. Colonel Belmore met them in the fog. He was gaunt now, his hands trembling, his speech slurred as though sleep had abandoned him months ago. When the Reverend demanded to see Eleanor, Belmore refused. He said only, "She's not mine to show anymore." The Reverend sprinkled salt across the threshold and began reciting verses of cleansing. The air grew heavier, the torches dimmed, and the horses bucked in terror. Then, from deep inside the quarters, came a thud, slow, deliberate, like fists striking wood from beneath the floor. Moments later, a scream split the evening sky. Not human, not animal. The Reverend dropped his Bible. Its spine cracked open to the book of Job. A gust of wind turned the page by itself, landing on a single verse. And the bones came together, bone to its bone. That night, the Reverend locked himself in the church. He would not preach again. When Reverend Harker's house was cleared after his death in 1863, parish workers found a small tin box sealed with wax and wrapped in cloth. Inside were 12 pages of faded notes written in trembling script. None ever preached from the pulpit. The first entry was dated October 3, 1851. The girl is alive, but she does not breathe as we do. Her skin glistens in the dark like oil upon water. She does not speak the Lord's tongue. The Father calls it an illness. I call it inheritance. He described a small room beneath the quarters, its walls lined with glass jars, each containing something pale and floating, hair, fingers, or small malformed organs. In the center, a wooden cot soaked in brine, and on it, a figure he could scarcely name. She smiled when she saw me, he wrote. But her mouth was wrong. It opened too wide. Her teeth had grown thin and pointed like the thorns of locust trees. She whispered, "Do you remember me before the color left?" The final entry trailed off mid-sentence, but the ink bled down the page as if written by a trembling hand. The Reverend never returned to Belmore after that night. Yet, witnesses claimed that on certain mornings, when the fog lifted from the fields, you could see him standing by the plantation gates, holding a Bible to his chest, staring toward the southern quarters, lips moving as though in prayer, but no sound escaping at all. Long before the Belmore estate fell into ruin, its enslaved people had begun keeping their own records, not in ledgers or ink, but in song. Words carried softly at night, verses changed by every tongue, preserving truths too dangerous to speak aloud. One such hymn survived in fragments, found in a trunk unearthed from a burned cabin near the swamp. She sleeps below, where the red water run. White child turned dark beneath the sun. The Lord won't take her, the ground won't keep. Belmore's daughter, don't fall asleep. Historians dismissed it as folklore, but the surviving field notes of a freedman named Isaac Rowe tell otherwise. He wrote of hearing a voice calling from the quarters at night, soft, childlike, yet wrong in tone, as if it came from somewhere deeper than the lungs. Isaac claimed the others stopped digging wells after one morning when the earth turned black and the water in their buckets began to move, rippling against no wind. She in the ground, he wrote. She listened when we speak her name. By the winter of 1852, half the slaves had fled into the swamp. Those who stayed began carving symbols onto the doors, circles within circles, meant to confuse whatever spirit lingered below. But one woman, old Mara, refused to leave. She said she had seen the child's face in the reflection of a wash basin, and the reflection had smiled back first. They said old Mara was born in chains and would die in them, but no one on the Belmore plantation ever spoke her name without lowering their voice. She was the midwife, the singer, the one who knew the bones. Even the colonel feared her. When the strange humming started again, that same lullaby no one could trace, Mara gathered a lantern, a rusted blade, and a pouch of salt. She told the others she was going to put the girl back where she belonged. The night was soaked in fog and insects. The quarters leaned with rot. Beneath one of the floorboards, she found what she'd been looking for, a narrow trapdoor, slick with moisture, the hinges rusted red. The stench below was unbearable, vinegar, rot, and the sweetness of spoiled milk. She lowered herself down a wooden ladder into the dark, her lantern trembling in her hand. The room beneath was lined with jars of cloudy liquid, each filled with parts of something once human. Eyes, hair, small curled shapes that looked almost fetal. On the far wall, a wooden crucifix, blackened and warped by heat. And then came the sound, a slow, wet dragging, like something crawling through shallow water. Mara whispered a prayer, threw salt into the dark, and lifted the lantern higher. The light caught a face. It was Eleanor's, or what was left of her. Her eyes were milky, her skin slick and gray, her teeth small and even like a child's. She smiled, whispering, "Mama said you'd come." Mara screamed, but the sound never reached the surface. When dawn broke over the cypress grove, the plantation was unnervingly silent. The birds did not sing. The air hung thick and sour, like meat gone bad. The others found Mara's lantern lying in the mud beside the quarters, its glass cracked, the flame inside still faintly flickering. Her pouch of salt had spilled open, but not onto the earth. The grains floated in a shallow pool of thick, black water seeping from the cracks between the floorboards. They called her name for hours, searching the swamp and fields. Nothing answered. But that night, one of the younger women, a girl named Annalise, swore she saw Mara standing at the edge of the cane rows. The shape was right, the gait was wrong. The figure moved slow, like bones remembering how to bend. When the others approached, it turned its head in a jerking motion that made a sound like rope tightening. Its mouth hung open as though sewn that way. From within, a whisper, "She's still hungry." The men fled. By morning, they found footprints leading from the quarters to the main house. Prints that began in bare feet and ended in something else entirely. Long, sharp, almost cloven impressions that sank too deep into the soil to belong to any human being. That same day, Colonel Belmore locked himself in his study and ordered the field hands to burn the southern quarters to the ground. But when they set the fire, it burned green, and the smoke smelled of perfume. The fire should have ended it. But as the southern quarters burned, Colonel Asa Belmore felt no relief, only the heavy press of air that comes before rain, though no rain fell. The flames refused to spread. They licked the wood, hissed green, and died in wet smoke. That night, the house began to speak. At first, it was the sound of breathing in the walls, faint, rhythmic, like the exhale of a sleeping child. Then came the knocking, 2 short raps near the chimney, followed by a dragging whisper that traced along the floorboards. The colonel, exhausted and half-drunk, took to his study with his phonograph, a new machine from New Orleans, capable of capturing sound on wax cylinders. He wanted proof of what he heard. For 3 nights, he recorded the house in darkness. On the 3rd, he played it back. At first, only static, the crackle of the machine. Then, faintly, a girl's voice. "Papa, it's so dark down here. I can see your heart through the floor." Belmore threw the phonograph across the room. The cylinder shattered, but the voice did not stop. It echoed in the walls, calling softly, pleading, then laughing, a small, brittle laugh that made the chandelier tremble. He sealed the study, nailed the windows shut, and scrawled verses from scripture across the walls in chalk. Servants heard him praying through the night, but by morning his voice was gone, replaced by the slow, steady hum of the same lullaby once heard from the quarters. The next day, the slaves refused to enter the house again. They said the colonel was still inside, talking to someone who was answering back. It was 3 weeks before anyone dared to approach Belmore House again. The fields had grown wild, the fences sagged, and the air smelled faintly of iron. The few laborers who remained said the lights in the study burned night and day, though no one saw the colonel come or go. When the sheriff and 2 townsmen finally forced the doors open, they found the house coated in dust, except for the study. That room was immaculate, like someone had been cleaning it over and over again. The walls were covered with mirrors, dozens of them, every size and shape, nailed in crooked lines from floor to ceiling. They faced one another endlessly, reflections folding back into reflections until no surface showed the true room. In the center sat Belmore's desk. Upon it, a single wax cylinder, unbroken, labeled in a trembling hand. Eleanor, 4th night. They played it once. At first, silence. Then the sound of footsteps, slow and uneven. A man's voice, the colonel's, whispering, "If you can hear me, child, speak once." What followed was the unmistakable sound of a heartbeat, deep, wet, and far too loud to belong to anyone living. Then, a soft reply, "I never stopped speaking, Papa. You just stopped listening." The sheriff ordered the house sealed. The mirrors were covered, the phonograph taken as evidence. But weeks later, when the cylinder was replayed in Baton Rouge for transcription, something else had appeared on it. Faint, low, impossible, a woman's breathing between every word. When they slowed the recording, the breathing formed syllables, not in English, not in any known tongue, but one word repeated clearly. Mara. The Baton Rouge Office of Records received the Belmore phonograph cylinder in the spring of 1853. It was catalogued as evidence in a case that never went to trial, because no living witness could agree on what they heard. The first transcriptionist, Mr. Lyle Tanner, reported a rhythmic pattern, possibly mechanical interference. 2 days later, he was found unconscious in his boarding room, both eardrums ruptured. On the wall above his bed, drawn in something dark and sticky, were 3 concentric circles, the same symbols the Belmore slaves had carved on their doors. His assistant, Miss Eliza Moore, took over the task. She wrote that when the recording played, the air in the office changed temperature, dropping nearly 20 degrees in seconds. The cylinder's groove seemed to shift beneath the stylus, as though the wax were breathing. She described hearing 2 voices, the colonel's and the girl's, overlapping. But behind them was a third, a rasping tone that didn't form words, only sounds that felt like meaning, pressing against the mind rather than the ear. After 40 seconds, she tore the needle from the machine and locked the office door. Her final written note read, "The voice is not on the cylinder. The cylinder is only where it hides." 3 days later, she vanished. When the office clerk opened her drawer, the cylinder was gone. In its place lay a single mirror shard, fogged on the inside, as if someone had breathed against it moments before. By the autumn of 1853, the church had heard enough. Reports from Baton Rouge spoke of a talking cylinder, of voices that could wound the mind, of mirrors fogging in rooms with no breath. The Diocese of St. Armand dispatched a small order of priests, not exorcists, but archivists, the kind sent when faith and fact began to overlap. Their leader, Father Jerome Coyle, was a scholar of unnatural relics, having once investigated a weeping statue in Savannah. He arrived in Baton Rouge with a single purpose, to destroy the Belmore recording. But the cylinder had already disappeared. In its place, the archivists found 7 mirrors, each marked on the back with a number, 1 through 7, and a wax seal pressed with the Belmore family crest. The reflection in those mirrors was wrong. They showed the room as it was, yet every surface seemed damp, as though viewed through a thin film of water. Father Coyle ordered them wrapped in cloth and shipped to the monastery at St. Armand for spiritual quarantine. The shipment never arrived. The cart was found overturned near the Tangipahoe River, the driver missing, the horses dead, their eyes milky white, their mouths full of water. Weeks later, one of the mirrors surfaced in a private collection in New Orleans. The curator described it as beautifully aged glass that hums when touched. He hung it in his gallery. Within 3 days, the building was condemned after all the clocks inside stopped at the same hour, 3:07 a.m., and the sound of a girl humming filled every room, though no one could find its source. Father Jerome Coyle arrived in New Orleans under a false name, claiming to be an antiquarian. He found the mirror displayed in a narrow gallery off Rue Darcy, surrounded by relics from forgotten estates, silver spoons, wilted portraits, and mourning jewelry woven with human hair. The mirror hung in the back room, draped in velvet, the curator insisting it sang at night. When Coyle lifted the cover, the air turned cold, and his reflection did not greet him. Instead, the glass showed the Belmore estate, though it had been burned years ago. The cypress trees swayed in windless silence, and in the doorway of the ruined house stood a figure in white, its face blurred by condensation. Coyle reached for his crucifix. The reflection moved first. Its lips parted, and the voice, faint but clear, filled the room. "You sealed me in words. But words break, Father." The curator screamed and fled as the glass began to ripple like a pond struck by stones. The priest recited verses, his voice shaking. The mirror answered not with sound, but with a pressure, the feeling of being watched from inside one's own eyes. Coyle struck the mirror with his cane. It cracked, splintering the reflection into 7 uneven shards. The humming stopped. He gathered the pieces, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them inside a consecrated chest marked Relic 23B. But when he returned to the monastery that night, the chest was already waiting on his bed, dry, untouched, and humming. By winter of 1853, the monastery at St. Armand had become a place of whispering corridors. The brothers, once steady in their prayers, began skipping matins and complaining of sleepless nights. Lamps sputtered in their rooms though the oil was fresh, and the walls seemed to breathe with each toll of the bell. Father Jerome Coyle kept the cracked Belmore mirror hidden beneath the chapel floor, sealed inside its consecrated chest. Yet he wrote that he could hear it humming beneath his prayers, the same tune recorded on the wax cylinder, that unfinished lullaby. In his journal he confessed, "When I speak his name, the echo comes back softer, not as a blessing, but as memory. I fear the house of God remembers something older than faith." The monks began to see reflections that weren't their own. In basins of water, in polished candlesticks, even in the black of their pupils. A girl in white, head tilted, watching. When they covered every reflective surface, the humming moved to the walls, as though the stone itself had learned to sing. On the seventh night, Brother Thomas tried to burn the chest. The fire refused to take. The wood grew slick, sweating clear water that hissed and extinguished the flame. By dawn, he was found kneeling before the altar, whispering over and over, "She's under the floor. She's under the floor." And when they pried open the boards, the chest was gone. The monastery at St. Armand was old, built on top of a burial ground for soldiers from the War of 1812. Father Coyle knew the tunnels beneath the chapel were supposed to be sealed, but when the brothers heard dripping from under the stone, he took a lantern and went alone. He described the descent in his final entry. The air tastes of metal. Each step sounds too loud, as if something listens. The water below reflects even where there is no light. At the lowest point he found a chamber carved from limestone, walls slick with condensation. In the center stood the consecrated chest, unopened, though its lid quivered as if something breathed inside. Around it, a circle of shallow bowls filled with clear water had been placed by unseen hands. The surface of each bowl shimmered, and in every reflection appeared a piece of Eleanor Belmore's face. An eye here, a mouth there, never the whole. Coyle knelt to pray. The humming began softly, spreading through the bowls until the air itself vibrated. Then a voice from the chest, fragile and childlike. "You brought me to a holier house. I made it mine." The water rose from the bowls, forming thin threads that stretched toward the ceiling, glistening like veins. When they touched the lantern flame, it hissed and went out. In total darkness, Coyle's last words scratched into the page were, "The reflection has learned to live without the mirror." He never returned to the surface. The next morning, the monks found only his crucifix, blackened, twisted, and wet. In 1854, St. Armand Monastery fell silent. No bells rang, no letters were sent. The diocese ordered an inquiry, but it was the state surveyors who arrived first, men of science, sent to document flood damage after a nearby levee collapsed. What they found was no flood. The monastery stood intact, but the grounds were coated in a thin film of water, perfectly still, as though the earth itself were sweating. Every window had shattered from the inside, yet there were no signs of violence, no footprints, no bodies. The church bell hung motionless, its tongue fused to the bronze like wax melted and cooled. The lead surveyor, Edwin Harrow, kept a notebook. His first entry reads, "We entered the chapel. The floor is damp, but there is no smell of rot. There are reflections where there should be none. The walls shine faintly, even in shadow." Harrow reported hearing voices underground, not words, but low tones that vibrated in his bones. His men refused to dig. That night, one went missing. They found him the next morning by the altar, kneeling, hands folded, eyes gone, sockets full of clear water. The team fled by noon, leaving their instruments behind. Weeks later, Harrow delivered his final report to the Louisiana Historical Office. It contained only a single line beneath his signature. "Belmore has roots. The water carries her." The monastery was sealed by state order. But months after, locals claimed that when rainwater pooled near the site, it never reflected the sky, only faces looking up from below. By the summer of 1855, the region surrounding St. Armand began to change. The bayous, once brown and slow-moving, turned glassy and unnaturally clear. Locals called it the season of mirror water. Fishermen refused to cast nets. They claimed that when they looked down, they saw not fish or reeds, but rooms, the interior of some unseen building beneath the surface. Walls, candles, pews, all swaying gently in the current. Some swore they saw people down there, pale and motionless, their eyes open, their mouths mouthing prayers that made no sound. Families living near the water started hearing knocking at night, like fingernails tapping at the glass of a window pane. One woman from Bayou de Cham reported that the knocking came from the inside of her mirror, and when she covered it with cloth, the tapping began beneath her floorboards. The parish priest, Father Lenore, attempted to bless the river. Witnesses said the water began to rise as he spoke, droplets lifting from the surface and floating midair. Then, without warning, it all fell silent. When they looked back, Lenore was gone. Only his rosary remained, still wet, beads rattling as if someone invisible held it. Word spread quickly. The superstition was simple: do not look into still water at night. But curiosity, as always, became the door. By autumn, children were daring one another to gaze into puddles after dusk, whispering a single name: Eleanor. And sometimes, the puddles whispered back. In 1856, 10 miles from Saint Armand, stood Bellgrave Manor, a decaying plantation house whose fields had long since turned to marsh. Its owner, Jonathan Bellgrave, was a man of old blood and older debts. He'd once boasted of wealth and servants. Now only his daughter, Clara, remained, a woman the townspeople whispered about for her strange weight and isolation. Behind the house stretched an ornamental pond, dug generations earlier by enslaved laborers. It had always been murky, a brown-green soup of cattails and frogs. But that summer, the water turned clear, so clear that one could see the silted bottom, lined with something that glittered faintly like glass. Jonathan wrote to a local reverend, claiming that his daughter had begun sitting by the pond for hours, staring into it as though it spoke to her. He described one night in his letter: "I heard her laughing. I called her name, and she turned, but her reflection did not. It kept facing me. When servants tried to drain the pond, they found that the water replenished itself overnight. Tools rusted, buckets cracked. By the third attempt, one worker vanished mid-task, his boots found standing upright at the edge, filled to the brim with clear water. Then came the smell, faint, sweet, like lilies left too long in the sun. Jonathan ordered the pond covered. By morning, the boards were soaked through and bowed outward, as if something beneath had been breathing. That night, Clara came to his room, her gown still dripping. She whispered, 'She showed me what lies below the house.' And behind her, though the floor was dry, her reflection left wet footprints as it walked away. The following night, Jonathan Bellgrave lit a lantern and followed the sound of dripping through the halls of his home. Clara's door hung open. Her bed was empty, her gown folded neatly upon the chair, still damp. The scent of lilies and rusted iron led him down the back stairs to the cellar door, which stood ajar. Inside, the air was heavy, metallic. Water seeped up between the flagstones, forming a thin, mirrored layer across the floor. His lantern light rippled across the surface, and in it, Clara's face appeared, staring upward from below, lips moving in silence. Jonathan called her name. The reflection smiled. He stepped closer. The water did not ripple beneath his boots. It was too still, as if frozen in thought. When he knelt, he saw her, or something shaped like her, standing beneath the surface, perfectly vertical, hair flowing as though she floated in a deeper pool. Then the lantern hissed. The flame bent sideways, drawn toward the reflection. He dropped it, and for a split second, the room blazed with orange light, revealing that the water covered more than the floor. The walls, too, were slick and pulsing, breathing in slow rhythm. Through the shimmering layer, shapes began to press outward: hands, faces, mouths that opened but did not breathe air. The lantern went out. Jonathan heard only the sound of his own pulse and his daughter's voice, whispering close to his ear, "You buried them beneath us. She only showed me their faces." When servants entered at dawn, the cellar was dry. The lantern lay on its side, and on the wall above it, scrawled in clear, wet script, "The water remembers." By 1857, word of the Bellgrave Pond had spread far beyond the parish. Stories whispered through taverns and churchyards that its water could heal, that the reflection one saw there could show the truth of a soul, even raise the dead. People began arriving on foot and by wagon, widows carrying portraits of lost sons, mothers clutching stillborn cradles, men dying of fever, hoping the water might mirror them whole again. Clara Bellgrave, now reclusive and ghost-pale, met them at the gate. She spoke softly, her body swathed in damp white linen. She would dip a silver cup into the pond and give each pilgrim a single sip, saying only, "Drink, and remember what was taken from you." Some claimed to see visions, loved ones standing in the water, hands outstretched. Others screamed, swore they'd seen their own corpses floating beneath the surface. By nightfall, those who drank began to change. Their skin grew clammy, their eyes glassed over as though they'd stared too long into sunlight. They moved without blinking, without rest. When the sheriff arrived weeks later to disperse the crowd, the manor stood empty. The pond was overflowing, spreading into the fields. Among the reeds, he found dozens of faces pressed just below the surface, open-eyed, perfectly preserved, as though the water had taken impressions of everyone who had come. In the mud at the edge of the water, he discovered Clara's cup, turned upside down, half buried. Inside it, a single droplet trembled like a heartbeat. That night, it rained for the first time in months, and wherever the rain pooled, the reflections blinked. In 1858, under orders from the Louisiana Territorial Office, the Bellgrave estate was declared condemned ground. The governor's decree cited unlawful gatherings, disease, and mass delusion. But internally, the memos told another story. Reports of men who returned from the Bellgrave site blind, their pupils turned to opaque glass, murmuring about voices under the surface. A federal crew of 22 men was sent to raise the property and drain the pond. They arrived with pumps, shovels, lime, and dynamite. The project's name, in the ledgers, was Operation Reflection. Their leader, Captain Reese Danner, wrote daily notes. His first entry reads, "The water is too clear. When we step near it, it clouds as though breathing out." They began digging channels to divert the pond. The water resisted, flowing backward, rising higher the more they cut. On the third night, a storm hit. Lightning struck the old manor, igniting the roof. But the rain did not douse it. Instead, the pond began to glow faintly from beneath, casting ripples of white light up the burning walls. By morning, 14 men were missing. Danner's last note: "We've pumped for 12 hours straight. The levels do not fall. The men say they hear someone counting under the water. Always the same number, 22. 2 days later, when the backup team arrived, they found the site silent. The pond was gone. The entire depression had filled with dry, cracked earth, as if it had never existed. Only the pumps remained, rusted solid, their interiors filled with human teeth. By 1871, the Bellgrave estate had faded into rumor, the kind old men told half-drunk at taverns to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. The land was resurveyed, sold cheap, and soon became the site of a new settlement called New Bellhaven. It began innocently. Wells were dug, foundations poured, streets mapped in perfect grid lines over soil that seemed solid enough. But when the first houses rose, strange things started happening. Water seeped through the ground, even during droughts, clear and cold, forming perfect circular puddles that never rippled, even in wind. Builders joked it was the old Bellgrave ghosts sweating through the dirt. Within months, several wells began showing mirror clarity, unnatural for the swampy soil. Town records note complaints that faces could be seen in the bucket water at night, faces not belonging to anyone in the house. Children refused to drink. Livestock fled the troughs. The town's first pastor, Reverend Elias Warren, reported that his baptismal basin reflected something below the surface, as if the floor beneath the church was made of glass. Soon, townsfolk began hearing faint singing from their wells, a slow, wet hum echoing up the stone. Some said it was a woman's voice. Others heard many, layered atop each other, breathing in unison. In September, Warren drained the church font and found the water replaced itself overnight. He sealed it shut with wax, then wrote in his Bible's margin, "The water does not come from the ground. It comes for us." By winter, New Bellhaven's map was revised again. Half the plots were abandoned, and where the town square once stood, a new pond had formed, perfectly circular, 22 feet wide. The locals called it simply the Remembering Pool. In the autumn of 1873, letters began arriving at post offices across Louisiana and Mississippi. Each was written in looping, old-fashioned script, sealed in wax stamped with a crest long forgotten, a lily wrapped in chains. They were addressed to only one surname, Bellgrave. No one knew how the letters found their way through official routes. The Bellgrave family had been declared extinct nearly 2 decades earlier, after Jonathan and Clara vanished. Yet, postal workers swore they had been processed through legitimate channels. The letters all contained the same message. Return to Belhaven. The house remembers. The water waits. One of those who received it was Elias Bellgrave, a distant cousin living in New Orleans, a failed merchant, widower, and drunk. He dismissed the letter at first, but that night he dreamt of a pond reflecting his childhood home. Except his reflection moved a moment too late. Within a week, he packed his belongings and boarded a riverboat north. When Elias arrived at the ruins of New Belhaven, the townsfolk refused to speak to him. They said the pond had grown. It now touched the church's steps, and every night, lanterns could be seen glowing beneath the surface, swaying as if carried by unseen hands. Elias spent his first evening at the old Bellgrave property, now reduced to stone and moss. He found the well cap broken, and from below came a smell of lilies. He lowered a candle into the darkness. For a moment, nothing. Then a hand reached up, dripping clear water, holding another letter, dry, untouched by moisture. It read, "Welcome home, Elias. She kept your reflection safe." Elias Bellgrave took lodging in the ruins of the old manor, a ruthless husk strangled by vines and silence. By day, he scavenged through the debris. Shards of porcelain, rusted silverware, fragments of the mirror once hung above the dining hall. By night, the pond called to him. The surface was flawless. Even wind refused to disturb it. When Elias leaned close, his reflection smiled before he did. And then, behind him, visible only in the reflection, a woman in white, standing at the water's edge. He turned. No one. But her image remained in the pond. He began writing by lamplight, desperate to document each vision. She stands beneath the surface, waiting. Her eyes do not rot. The water is not a grave, but a mirror turned inside out. The townsfolk watched from afar as Elias spoke to the water nightly. They heard him whisper names, Jonathan, Clara, Eleanor, as if reciting a prayer. Sometimes he laughed softly. Other times he screamed. On the 7th night, lightning split the sky, and witnesses swore they saw 2 figures standing at the pond, one of flesh, one of light. Their movements mirrored until one, the reflection, stepped forward and the surface shattered outward like glass. When the storm cleared, the pond was silent again. Only Elias's boots remained on the bank, filled to the brim with clear, unmoving water. And in the center of the pond, something new had appeared. A mirror, half buried, its silvered surface glowing faintly from within, showing not the sky, but the inside of the house, perfectly intact and waiting. By 1874, New Belhaven had split in two, one town of sunlight and one beneath the surface. It began when a child disappeared. Her name was Martha Warren, the pastor's niece. She'd been seen last playing near the pond, tossing pebbles across its glassy face. Her mother swore she'd turned away for only a moment. When she looked back, Martha was inside the reflection, standing on the other side of the water, waving. When they tried to reach her, the surface felt solid as marble. Within days, others saw houses beneath the pond, perfect replicas of the real town, flickering like candlelight in the depths. As dusk fell, faint silhouettes moved through those mirrored streets. Some swore they saw themselves walking there, others saw their dead. Reverend Warren led a vigil, begging God to reclaim what the water had stolen. But during the prayer, one of the candles slipped from his hand and rolled into the pond. It did not extinguish. It kept burning, drifting downward, illuminating streets, doors, windows, all swaying below. That night, the reflection town's lights blinked on for the first time. Gas lamps that hadn't been lit in years began glowing beneath the surface. Bells tolled, but the sound came upward, muffled, like breath through wet cloth. By morning, half the wells in New Belhaven had turned mirror clear. When people peered into them, they saw the same streets, the same faces, looking back, but smiling when they themselves did not. Those who stared too long vanished by nightfall. In their houses, mirrors dripped. Their reflections remained. And so the locals gave the pond a new name, Bellgrave's Looking Glass. In 1875, reports of this sunken town reached Washington. The era of science had arrived, and superstition, they believed, could be disproved. The U.S. Geological Survey dispatched a team of 4 men led by Professor Warren Lyle, armed with the newest marvel, a wet plate camera capable of capturing reflections in perfect detail. They arrived at New Bellhaven in mid-July, when the heat was dense enough to still the insects. The pond looked like a sheet of molten silver. Even the clouds avoided its reflection. Lyle's first photographs were ordinary: reeds, old stones, ripples. But when the plates were developed that night in the makeshift darkroom, something emerged: figures standing beneath the surface. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, their faces calm, eyes open, staring upward at the camera. Every plate captured different faces. Every exposure revealed more. On the third day, one assistant, Henry Poe, wandered too close to the bank. The camera flash went off by accident, and when the smoke cleared, only his tripod stood. His hat floated on the pond, turning slowly, as though placed there. Lyle fled with the remaining plates, insisting they documented an optical inversion. But when the negatives were examined in Baton Rouge, the reflections began to move within the glass, even as the plates dried. Archivists reported that the figures blinked when the room went dark. By dawn, all the images had blackened entirely, except for one. That single surviving plate, now lost to history, was described in the records. A town perfectly intact, beneath the water. Bellhaven reversed. The camera captured a world that was watching back. Within a week, Professor Lyle was found drowned in his study, a glass of clear water overturned beside him. By the 1890s, America had fallen in love with death. Parlors filled with mediums, spirit photographers, and women in black silk who promised they could translate the silence of the grave. Among them was Evangeline Mott, a celebrated spiritualist from New York who claimed she could record the voices of the drowned. When she read of Bellhaven and the so-called town beneath the water, she saw it not as curse, but invitation. In 1892, she arrived at the site with a group of 6 believers and an early phonograph cylinder recorder. The town above was abandoned by then. Only ruins and willow trees, the pond still unbroken, its surface gleaming even under the moon. They held their séance at midnight, sitting in a circle on the bank. Evangeline began humming, a low, rhythmic chant matching the pulse of the waves. She placed the recorder beside her and whispered, "We call upon those who dwell below. Speak through the stillness. Let us hear what the water remembers." For nearly an hour, nothing. Then, the pond trembled. Ripples formed from the center outward, inward, as though something beneath was inhaling. The phonograph needle began to move. The wax hissed, clicked, and then, music. A choir. Faint, distant, but human. Voices layered over each other, dozens deep, singing a melody older than language, their tones wet and glistening. One of the men, entranced, leaned too close. His reflection reached up, pressing palm to palm against his. The water didn't break. But when he pulled away, the imprint of another hand remained on his skin, cold, translucent, perfect. When the séance ended, they fled, leaving the recorder behind. The next morning, a farmer found it still spinning. The cylinder played backward on its own, repeating a single phrase in a woman's voice. "We have built the church below." In 1904, advances in diving technology brought new curiosity to forgotten legends. An expedition funded by the Louisiana Institute of Geology sought to disprove local myth by exploring the pond at Bellhaven, known in official reports as Site B-22, a number chosen with chilling coincidence. The team consisted of 3 divers and 2 surface operators. Their goal: descend to the pond's floor, map its dimensions, and retrieve any man-made artifacts. But according to the recovered logbook, the pond had no measurable bottom. At 12 feet, the water remained clear. At 20 feet, visibility improved. At 30 feet, the divers began to see light below them, as if another sun burned beneath the pond. The lead diver, Robert Vail, reported through the line, "We're seeing structures like buildings. Windows, doors. There's something walking down there." Static flooded the receiver. The surface team heard muffled breathing, then a single word, distorted. Reflected. 2 minutes later, Vail's line went slack. When they pulled it up, the harness was intact, but the suit was empty, filled only with crystal-clear water. The second diver followed protocol, attempting recovery. He descended halfway before screaming through the receiver. "He's here, right here, but he's facing the wrong way." Then silence. The mission was terminated. Only one camera, weighted to the pond's center, was retrieved days later. The developed footage showed a town beneath, inverted like a photograph, lamplight in windows, a chapel spire rising downward, and figures walking along the underside of the water's surface. At the edge of the film, a reflection of the camera itself appeared, but the operator's face was not the man who filmed it. The pond was officially sealed once again. But even in sealed darkness, the divers' air bubbles still rose. From below, by 1911, the Bellhaven Pond had been fenced off, its location erased from maps. But erasure is not destruction. It is an invitation for memory to rot in peace. The first sign came through photographs. A family portrait taken in New Orleans showed, behind the seated mother, a faint reflection of a man in a top hat and frock coat, though no mirror stood there. In another image, a classroom photo from Mississippi, every child's reflection in the window was facing the wrong direction. Then came the dreams. People hundreds of miles apart began reporting the same vision. A large, still pond. A house beneath the surface. A door that opens inward, but never outward. When Professor Edmund Lyle, a folklorist at Tulane University, received dozens of such accounts, he traced them to one thing: descendants of the Bellgrave line. Some bore the name openly. Others had changed it generations ago, yet all dreamed of water. Lyle's notes, later found scattered across his study floor, described his final experiment. He placed a mirror before his bed and slept facing it. His final entry read, "If the house beneath is real, then the reflection must be the doorway. I will enter tonight." He was never seen again. But every mirror in his home, when covered with cloth, bulged slightly outward, as if something behind the glass was pressing to get through. In the years that followed, museums, hotels, and courthouses across the South reported the same anomaly. Reflections that did not match, glass that dripped when touched, and water stains appearing beneath portraits of long-dead plantation families. The Bellhaven curse had evolved. It was no longer tied to land or lineage. It had become an idea, and ideas can travel anywhere a reflection exists. Today, the land where Bellhaven Plantation once stood lies abandoned, its coordinates omitted from every modern registry. The forest has reclaimed the manor's foundations, but not the pond. That pond remains perfectly intact. Still, circular, eternal. Those who find it, hikers, surveyors, drifters, report the same unsettling quiet. No insects hum. No leaves fall into the water. And if you linger long enough, you will begin to notice that your reflection doesn't move with you. In 1952, a journalist named Hannah Price tracked down the site, chasing whispers of a mirror town beneath the South. Her reel-to-reel tape survived, her body did not. On it, her trembling voice says, "I see them walking upside down. Their eyes are open. They're not dead, they're waiting." The tape ends with a splash and a long, wet inhale, not of fear, but of surrender. Today, the water level of the Bellhaven Pond never changes, even in drought. No animals drink from it. And every decade, at midnight on October 14th, the surface glows faintly, as if reflecting a sunrise from somewhere deep below. Locals have learned not to look, because if you stare long enough, you may begin to recognize faces, not of strangers, but of those you've lost. And if you lean too close, you'll see something worse. They're watching you too. They've learned to look up. So the next time your reflection seems delayed, when your eyes blink just half a second too late, remember the name Bellhaven, and whisper it softly before turning away, because the water remembers, and sooner or later, it remembers you.